Hello and welcome. The most observant among you will notice the name of the podcast has changed. This is due to the previous name being one which was difficult for people to find, and I was advised by a few people that I should rebrand, so I took that advice on board. The other thing you'll notice very quickly is that I'm recording on my own today, which is a new experience, something I have not done before, but something that was also recommended to me and something that made sense for me to be able to create more regular content so that I can, one, explore the ideas on my own by effectively thinking out loud, and one, so that I can share those ideas and share my thoughts and invite feedback, criticism, and anything else that might help me to see where I'm going wrong and to aid my journey to understanding and development. So, today I'm going to be discussing Fragile by Stella O'Malley. The subtitle being Why We Feel More Anxious, Stressed, and Overwhelmed Than Ever, and What We Can Do About It. Stella O'Malley is a psychotherapist based in Ireland. She's now best known for her work in the field of gender, where she's become somewhat of a world leader, I would say. You may know her from Gender A Wider Lens, the podcast, or from many organisations such as GenSpect or Therapy First. This book, however, predates that period where she was working with gender and focuses specifically on anxiety and how we can manage it, what we can do about it, and what it is. So I invite you to take a dive with me into the depths of anxiety and into the depths of Fragile by Stella O'Malley. So what I think Stella wanted to achieve with this book is probably based on this is conjecture on my part, but I think she's probably basing it on her experiences as a psychotherapist, in that, and this is something that was raised by Abigail Schreier in her recent book, Bad Therapy. It's also something that I know Carl Jung raised previously with a slightly different flavor to it, where people often go to therapy for things that don't inherently require a therapist. And actually, at times, going to a therapist for something that would not require a therapist can run a risk of exacerbating the issue. So, when Carl Jung spoke about it, he wrote an essay, I believe it was called Psychotherapy or the Clergy, something to that effect. It's been a long time since I read it. But his hypothesis in that was that many of the reasons that people went to therapy in at that time that he was writing were related to spiritual guidance or life advice that would previously have been handed out through attending church and getting guidance from the clergyman. In Abigail Schreier's more recent book, she's basically saying that there are normal human experiences which we pathologize by acting as if they require a professional input. So one of those might be the experience of anxiety, because experiencing anxiety is a normal emotion and everyone experiences anxiety to some degree or another. The other thing is that she basically, in the case of Schreier, she's basically saying that there are other areas where people can seek support beyond therapy. And historically, you would have been supported by your family, you would have been supported by your community, you would have been supported by the institutions you're a part of. And that is where the overlap comes with Carl Jung's theory that the church would have provided that role. What Stella O'Malley is doing in this book is saying there are many things you can do to address anxiety and difficulties at home by yourself that don't necessarily require the input of a therapist, which is a bad business model if you're a psychotherapist, but demonstrates some integrity because of the fact that trying to encourage people not to go to therapy is counterproductive to your business aims. So I actually think, knowing a lot of O'Malley's work from listening to her podcasts and stuff, I think she may have revised her position slightly since this book. In that, I think in this book she was maybe more encouraging of people accessing therapy than she might be now. But again, that's speculation. So, with those sort of surrounding contexts of what I think she was trying to achieve, I think she achieved it very well. I think this book's very accessible and very easy for people to read. I think that it has lots of very practical, useful tools, and I think its framing of how we experience and should respond to anxiety is really positive in that it doesn't treat anxiety as this huge pathology. It treats it as part of the typical range of human experiences. And it sort of has the I think there's an essence of Viktor Frankl in this from Man's Search of Meaning, where he says everything can be taken but from a man, but one thing, the last of all human freedoms, the right to choose one's own way. And I think this book captures that essence because it's basically saying you can have these negative experiences, but there is something that is always within your control, which is how do you respond to experiencing these negative emotions and how do you respond to that challenge. It also reminds me of the Dostoevsky quote where he says, there is only one thing I fear, which is not to be worthy of my sufferings. Because I think it basically says that your experience through being challenging calls upon you to face that challenge and become better, to become more than you are, because the only way you overcome a challenge, it wouldn't be a challenge if it were easy for you to deal with in your current state, but it might become easy to deal with were you to grow and develop as a person. So I think that within the negative experiences, there's a call to improvement. The sort of, I guess, the call to heroicism or heroism. It doesn't matter. You understand what I'm saying. Now, that said, I'm perhaps not the target audience for this book to some degree because I am maybe more intellectually, academically inclined. And so when she's exploring what anxiety is, she gives a typology of basically sort of characters that she sees who experiences anxiety, describing what their symptoms might be, how it might manifest in their behavior. And there are a variety of different ones. And I think that's probably really good. And everyone will find something within it they relate to, even if they don't experience anxiety to a problematic level, and it's just sort of typical low level anxiety that people experience as they go through about their lives. I feel I enjoy, or maybe, yeah, I would say enjoy or perhaps benefit more from a more comprehensive, or I guess a deeper level of analysis for what anxiety is. But that's a personal preference. That's not a criticism of this book, because I think this book was had a different aim, and so I think that the level of analysis used in the book was perfectly suited to its aim. But I'll give you an example of the sort of analysis of anxiety that I wanted further exploration of. Now, I first came across a lot of this idea from Lisa Feldman Barrett's How Emotions Are Made, although I don't think she is by any means the originator of this sort of concept. But she is a neuroscientist, and she was primarily focused on how we experience emotions on, I guess, a neurobiological level, but how that manifests in our behavior as well. And one of the interesting things is that neuroscientists don't tend to refer to emotions necessarily as afraid, upset, happy, embarrassed. They strip it down to two dimensions. One is a spectrum of arousal from low to high, which is basically how alert you are, how much energy you have, how much primed you are for movement and engagement and activity. And the other is valence, which is basically positive to negative. Is this a positive experience? How positive is it? Is it a negative experience? How negative is it? And that sort of goes on a spectrum. And the analogy I always use is like a color palette on apps like Microsoft Paint. We might say red, and in this case I'll use red to refer to anger because it has that connotation. We might say red, but within that color palette there are many different shades of red, and there are points where red shades into brown and it's ambiguous as to what it is. And emotions are like that, because there is almost a unique texture and fingerprint to every experience of an emotion. You don't feel upset one day and feel upset another day and experience those identically. One day you might be upset in a very anxious and aroused way, where you are moving around and pacing and fretting. One day you might be upset in a more depressive way, where the arousal is very low and you're sort of lying in bed and feeling, oh, I can't do this anymore. One day you might be upset and it's sudden and comes out of nowhere and you're just in floods of tears, and then you feel a release afterwards. So they're very different, but they might all be categorized as upset. So there's different textures to these emotions. And anxiety is the same. There is low level anxiety where you maybe are about to speak in public, but you've spoken in public a lot before, but you still experience a low level anxiety where you're sort of, you're a bit more alert, you're a bit more on edge. You're a little bit tunnel vision to what you're about to do. You're playing things through in your mind, and you feel a little bit of tightness in your chest. Just an example. And then there's anxiety where you're having a full-blown panic attack and you feel like you can't breathe, you can't function, and you're a mess on the floor. And that's a very different experience of anxiety compared to the slight tight chest, slightly on edge. So the way this seems to come about, from my understanding, is that the way the brain operates. And it seems that the brain, so there are basically two ways you can think about the brain potentially operating. One is reactive and one is predictive. Realistically, it's not binary. There's always going to be elements of two of them. But if you think about, from an evolutionary perspective, if the brain was solely reactive and you are walking on the plains of Africa and you hear a rustle in a bush, everything is working on a reaction. So you hear that rustle, you turn your head to look for the rustle, you see something, perhaps a lion, and you then go, okay, there's a lion, what do I do? And you run away. This might be done in fractions of a second, but those fractions of a second are giving the lion an advantage because they could effectively be the difference between life and death, those fractions of a second. Now, if your brain is working in a predictive manner, you're walking along, you don't anticipate anything happening, you hear a rustle, and your brain goes, okay, this could mean danger, this could mean a threat, or it could be the wind blowing, and it sort of runs those two potentialities and it primes itself until you get something to decide which way it goes. So before you've even looked at the bush, your body is alert and preparing you for action. I can give you a rather amusing anecdote for this. Um, I was walking to work the other day and I had my phone in my hand and I was looking at that, and I walked past someone's garden, and behind the fence there was a small dog which I didn't see because I was looking at my phone. And you know how small dogs are. It waited until I was basically right next to it to start barking aggressively at me. And in before I could even process what was happening in my conscious thought, my body was primed, ready to run away. I could feel everything was tense and my legs sort of spread apart. I got stood more upright. I was ready to run, and I looked down towards the dog at the same time. And I could feel the adrenaline going. My heart was beating quicker. My breath sort of like I felt my chest tighten. And I looked down, and there was a small dog barking, and I sort of laughed it off. Thought that was ridiculous. The severity of my reaction compared to what was actually happening. And it does seem ridiculous if you think about it as almost ran away from a small dog. But if you think about it in terms of the brain making predictions, my brain was going, everything's okay. I've done this walk a load of times. Nothing really unusual happens. Something that I'm not predicting is happening. Potential threat. React accordingly. And that makes it seem a lot more rational because you're priming yourself to react to that threat. So that just gives you an example of how a predictive model of brain processing works. And you probably saw it as well. There was that trend a few years ago of people showing cucumbers to their cats, and cats have very little interactions with cucumber, and would never have done in their sort of environment of evolutionary adaptation. So when a cat sees a cucumber, its brain goes, snake. Snakes are a predator and a threat, run away. So it's quite easy to understand how a predictive brain offers a survival advantage over a reactive brain. And some of the evidence we have backing this up is the fact that I won't be able to name the parts of the brain off the top of my head, but basically more signal comes from the brain to the eye than comes from the eye to the brain. And that seems to be that what we're expecting to see, we see in the world, and then we have to correct the errors. Almost like a YouTube video rendering where it only re-renders the pixels that have changed and keeps much of it the same. So with that in mind, we also have a bias towards the negative in terms of how we're going to react to things. To give you an example, if I'm in a burning building, I am going to, sorry. So these predictions, I can see two places where anxiety arises. Tripping over myself slightly there. So there are two places where I can see anxiety arising from this. Actually, no, I'm going to go back. Sorry. We also have a bias towards the negative. And again, you can think of this in evolutionary terms, because if you fail to react to, if you get, say, a false negative when it comes to threat, where you believe there is no threat present and there is a threat present, then the probability of survival decreases significantly. Whereas if you believe there is a threat present and there isn't a threat present, i.e. a false positive, that doesn't have an impact on your survival because there's no threat present. So we have got this bias towards negative occurrences because there is the risk associated with them. It doesn't matter if I prepared myself to run from that dog and that dog turned out not to be a risk. It does matter if I didn't prepare myself to run from that dog and that dog did was significantly larger than it was and had access to me and were able to successfully attack me. That would have been an issue. So from that predictive brain model and the negativity bias that we experience, it's very easy to see two situations where anxiety might arise. One is if all of the negatives, all of the potentialities that are available are highly probable to be negative. The burning building, if I'm inside a burning building, then and my brain's trying to predict what's going to happen next, almost every scenario needs me to be experiencing negative valence because I need to be uh, motivated to move away from the threat, and high arousal because I probably need to act quite quickly. And so it's reasonable for me to experience anxiety in that situation because I need to act, I need to move to preserve my life. What happened, the other potential scenario where you can see anxiety arising, and this, to me, although the predictive brain model has been criticized for perhaps making us sound too robotic, and I don't think we're quite as machine-like as the term prediction can make you, the connotations of the term prediction can be a bit more robotic than human beings are. But um, another model that's been proposed by Carl Friston is entropy, anxiety in relation to entropy. So he would say that when the number of potentialities is constrained, i.e. entropy is constrained, then the level of anxiety should be low, whereas when it is unconstrained and entropy increases, what I would call that in the predictive model is the number of potentialities increases, then there should be a heightened level of anxiety because the level of certainty about what's happening next is lower. But even if there is plenty of positive outcomes that may occur, there's still going to be an increase of potential negative outcomes that might occur when the certainty is lower, and those are the ones that you're more primed to prepare for. So to steal an analogy from Jordan Peterson, when you are driving to work, you're in your car, everything's going fine, it's a route that you've done, there's no need for anxiety, everything's quite clear. The second your engine management light comes on and you stutter to a halt, the amount of entropy increases drastically because you're no longer in a simple car, you're in many different parts, many different things of the car, you don't know what's wrong with it, you don't understand it, and the number of things that you have to deal with and compute that are beyond you has increased significantly. And then you have second order consequences of, I'm going to be late for work, I'm going to be late for my appointment, how's my boss going to react, how's my client going to react, What, and you can cascade this even further to, what if this impacts on my job? What am I going to do about my um, income? How am I going to keep my family? How am I going to pay my rent? What if I end up homeless? There's a cascade that can happen, and that cascade demonstrates the unconstrained entropy. So this sort of builds up. This basically maps quite nicely, I think, onto the attachment theorist model, the concept of the internal working model, which is basically you have an internal representation of the world and how it functions and how it's likely to function that you use to make the predictions. And although they spoke about it primarily in terms of relationships to caregivers, I think it can actually be broadened to talk about how you interact with the world as a whole. So if, for example, someone who's experienced childhood trauma, one of the symptoms we might anticipate is something called hypervigilance, where they seem to be in a state of um, high arousal constantly and slight bias towards the negative affect, or um, negative valence, or potentially significant bias towards the negative valence, depending. And that is because they have, through their experiences, they have learned that negative experiences are more probable and um yeah, they're just more probable, and they've come to expect that. Say if it's from an interaction with a person, maybe they have less constraints on their anticipations about what someone might do, because typically if you haven't experienced, say, physical abuse, the people you interact with don't assault you, then you don't really expect people you interact with to assault you. Whereas if you have been assaulted many times, then that becomes a more prominent potentiality in your mind when you're making predictions that you're using to anticipate what's going to happen. So you're more likely to experience anxiety. So this also gives a potential solution to managing anxiety. This is how I've explored anxiety so far, and this is sort of me giving the different version of what anxiety looks like, a different level of analysis in the way that I would enjoy reading, I guess. But it crosses over, both levels of analysis cross over very nicely with effectively how O'Malley frames her solution, I guess, because I think she relies very heavily in this. Take some water. So she relies very heavily on the model of exposure therapy as a solution. And exposure therapy has a lot of crossovers with cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, as well. And in this sense, I think that this book, although it predates Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, it has many, many parallels, one of which is this sort of framing of some of the current social trends as working contrary to effective therapeutic models. So both Stella O'Malley's level of analysis for anxiety and the level of analysis that I've just sort of put forward, both of them uh, join in the proposed solution that sort of emerges from that level of understanding, which is the reprogramming of your internal working model to predict less drastic outcomes from the potential scenarios that might play out, and to predict less negative scenarios playing out where it's disproportionate. Because one thing I think Stella does very well in this book is framing anxiety as part of the typical human experience, and anxiety as something that is appropriate and normal and everyone experiences it. I gave the example earlier of, if you're going to talk, the low level of anxiety there, that's useful because you need to be more alert. It's also useful if you need to avoid threats. It's reasonable that we experience anxiety in response to negative scenarios because anxiety keeps us alive. But experiencing anxiety when we are not in situations that warrant it suggests that that internal working model has been biased in some way towards anticipating negative outcomes or negative experiences. So we either think they're more likely, or the outcomes are going to be worse. And the solution to that is to work on reprogramming that internal working model. You have to slowly and gradually demonstrate to yourself that negative outcomes aren't as likely as you anticipate them being, and where things that are not unexpected things do take place and challenges do take place, you are capable of overcoming them without drastic consequences. And this is something I've always advised to people who maybe lack self-confidence, or who feel uncertain, or who struggle with their mental health. I'm always advising people, do something at the limits of your ability that will challenge you significantly and show yourself that you can do it. Don't set yourself a goal that's too low, because if you're not challenged, then you don't learn anything from it. You have to be challenged. And then once you're challenged, you will find that you start to learn. Apologies if you can hear the scratching in the background. That's the cat on a scratching post, just making her contribution. So the way exposure therapy works is, you say, if you had a fear of going outside, I'm going to use an example from someone I know. If you have a fear of going outside, agoraphobia, it might be too much to run outside, spike your anxiety massively, become completely overwhelmed, have a panic attack, and then go back inside, because then you're reinforcing in your model of the world that going outside is dangerous, all these negative things happen. So you take gradual steps towards it. It might be something like standing on a balcony if you have one. It might be something like standing at the door or a window with it open, looking out into the outside world. It might be getting someone to record a video of the outside world, or a trip into the outside world from your house, and watching that. There are all these sort of ways you can decrease the level at which you're encountering it, and you would find the lowest level that is a challenge to you, in that you will feel uncomfortable and you will spike some level of anxiety, but is not so challenging that you'll be overwhelmed. And you go through that. I'm going to use the balcony example because I was speaking to someone about this the other day. You go out onto the balcony for 2 minutes. You calm your breathing. You make sure that you feel comfortable. You come back in. You've just built up one experience in your mind of, that was something I could do. That was something that's achievable. And nothing bad happened. The next time you go out for 5 minutes, nothing bad happens. You've reinforced that nothing bad happens when you go outside. You build this up, eventually you're saying, out on the balcony for half an hour or an hour, and you think maybe I could go and stand outside my front door so my whole body's outside, there isn't a balcony protecting me. And you go out, and the first time you manage 30 seconds, 2 minutes, whatever it is, and you come back in. And you can see how gradually you build this up, you build this up, you build this up. What you don't want to do is avoid it. Because if you avoid it, you're reinforcing the opposite. And often you'll see people who avoid things that provoke anxiety in them will increase their anxiety. They'll become anxious about more things. So, um, for I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head, and I'm struggling. But someone might be anxious about public speaking. To go back to that example, so they avoid public speaking, but they still experience the anxiety. And then suddenly it becomes speaking in a social situation around friends. Then it becomes interacting with large groups of people. Then it becomes interacting with one person, because as you're avoiding it, you're reinforcing the idea that this is a risk, this is a risk, this is a risk. And your brain starts to predict that risk in more and more situations because you've galvanized that idea. And this is sort of the basic model. I mean, there's a lot more specifics. There's a lot more different methods. Mindfulness is very good at it for this, because you can teach yourself to recognize thoughts and not react to them. So when something comes up in your brain that says, I'm concerned by this, you can go, okay, I acknowledge that thought. Thanks for sort of giving me the warning. I don't need it right now. And also you become better attuned to your body and being able to regulate your breath and your heart rate and all the other things that would signal to your body that you are in a state of panic. So there's lots of different examples, and this book is really good for providing those. And that is the most valuable sort of takeaway from it, I guess. What's interesting then is when she goes on to criticize some aspects of our culture for how they would work contrary to this idea. And this is where there's a massive overlap with the coddling of the American mind. This book actually predates Lukianoff and Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, but she references a paper they'd written prior to writing the book, which covered the same idea. So there's a crossover of thinking around a similar period. And basically this sort of covers things like safe spaces and trigger warnings. There's no evidence to say that trigger warnings are effective. There is some evidence to say that they may spike some level of anxiety in people who are anxious already. There's no evidence to say that they're beneficial, because effectively what a trigger warning does, if you think about the model of exposure therapy that O'Malley lays out in the book and that I've just laid out to you there, a trigger warning is basically saying something is going to happen that you need to be worried about. It's priming you for negative emotion and anxiety rather than helping you to avoid triggers, because triggers in the meaningful sense, when you're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, where the concept of triggers would sort of be most clearly associated, triggers for someone who's suffering PTSD are unpredictable. You don't necessarily know what's going to trigger you. So it's very difficult to avoid them in that sense. And again, avoidance can be reinforcing of the behaviors that you're and the patterns that you're trying to avoid. And I think that safe spaces, So safe space is an interesting one because there is a time and a place for a safe space, but creating them in places like creating this concept of safe spaces in universities and such is suggesting that the outside world is dangerous. It's reinforcing that idea. Safe space, in a very constricted and practical sense, you want to generate a safe space when you're with your therapist or your social worker or with your friends, and it's not a safe space in that there is no potentiality for a risk to arise or for something difficult or challenging. It's more a relational safety, I would say, where you feel that whatever happens, you've got someone with you. You've got someone who is going to take some of that burden, who is going to make it a little bit easier to deal with, and who's going to make sure that you get through the challenge unscathed. And this is where I think the role of a therapeutic relationship really becomes valuable in dealing with issues like anxiety, because if you are if you have that therapeutic relationship, you increase your capacity to face challenges without becoming dysregulated in your emotions and overwhelmed. So when I gave the example of exposure therapy of going out onto the balcony, then at the first point where you're starting to go outside, it might be very anxiety provoking, but you might have someone that you feel very comfortable with who makes you feel more safe than you would do on your own. And so their presence can help you do that. And this is why a therapist can play an important role in exposure therapy. If you've built a trusting relationship with that therapist, then they are going through that process alongside you. They can't go through that process for you, but they can go through it alongside you, shoulder to shoulder, and that reassures you and gives you a little bit of extra strength. The hazard in that is that you can become dependent in it. So there has to be a point where those relationships draw back, but they draw back in a structured way where there's an agreement. And one of the things that I've done when I've used exposure therapy style techniques with people I've been working with is I'll say to them, look, the important part of this is you know that at any point, if this gets too much and you feel that I'm pushing you too hard, you can say no, and I will stop. I will respect that 100%. So you have control, and that's what that's what that relationship's reinforcing in their mind is you have some level of control over this. But I will always caveat that with don't use this as an excuse. You still have to challenge yourself. You have to sit with the discomfort. It's only when we reach the edge of what we can do today that we draw it back. And I will try and look out for that as well. And I will try and draw you back if I think that we're pushing too far at once. And so that's sort of the utility in it. And that's where safe spaces are at their optimum. But if you think about the concept of a safe space, say as it's enacted in universities, it's basically saying here's a space where we are saying that something's not going to happen. You don't necessarily have a relationship with the people there, although you may form social groups of people there. But that's not necessarily a good thing, because if you're starting to associate with people who are also prone to anxiety principally, then you are going to have external networked feedback enforcing the idea that anxiety is the right course of action, the right response to your situation. So that's not necessarily a good thing in and of itself. So you're not going to necessarily have a relational stability there. You're just going to be using that as an avoidance strategy if you go to a place where it's just, I'm going to go and avoid the thing that's stressing me out. So that's sort of where she comes in on the cultural changes, and where there's a lot of alignment between my thinking and hers. One of the things that she does talk on, and this will probably be my last point, one of the things that she does talk on, that where there's some disagreement between me and her, focuses she speaks about people being very busy, which is ironic because from what I know of her, she is someone who fills their time to a significant degree. And she basically talks about the constant demands and the level of busyness that we experience causing increases in anxiety and the need to slow down and take more time for ourselves and the sort of self-care approach. um Self-care in itself is a concept that I find challenging because self-care can sometimes actually be more a case of self-neglect or self-enablement. There was a Will Smith video that got shared around ages ago, prior to the slap, when he was less controversial. Um, he went through a bit of a phase of posting up sort of motivational videos, and there was one that I really liked where he said self-care is not having pizza. Self care is saying, I'm not going to have that slice of pizza because it's bad for me. So self care involves a level of discipline, and self care might be something like, I'm going to make sure that I allot at least 8 hours for sleeping. I'm going to make sure that I eat enough meals. I make sure that I get rest. I'm going to make sure I'm hydrated. It's looking after those physiological needs to prime yourself to deal with things. My point of contention, I guess, that with what O'Malley is suggesting, and I don't think this would be a point of contention were we to sit down and discuss it, is the focus on busyness. People are often capable of doing and achieving far more than they believe themselves to be able to. There's a lot of self-imposed constraints, and you can relate that to the concept of the internal working model, as I have been doing. And if you're filling your time with the right things, the things that you get enjoyment from, or you're teaching yourself to get enjoyment from the things that you have to do, then I don't think that being busy is inherently anxiety provoking in itself. It's something that I have conversations with people quite often, because people will say to me, where's your time for rest? Where are you sort of looking after yourself? Where's the self-care? And I'll say, well, I enjoy the things I do. For the large part, I enjoy my work. There are aspects of it I don't enjoy, but that's life. Um, I enjoy my martial arts training. I enjoy my reading. I enjoy uh, the podcast. I enjoy having conversations with people. I'm enjoying this, even if it's a slightly alien experience. Um, it's nice to be able to get my thoughts out and to talk things through and see if I can make them coherent. So if you enjoy the things you're doing, there's nothing wrong with being busy. There is probably a need to make changes in your life if you are experiencing anxiety at the anticipation of having to do the things that you have to do in your life. And people will say that's not possible, but it usually is possible. There might be some scenarios where it's not possible at all, or it's not possible immediately, but there's quite a lot of choice available most of the time. And so I guess that what I felt was lacking was that balance, that balancing perspective of saying, well, actually being busy isn't inherently a problem as long as you're busy with things that sustain you, that give you energy, and that you enjoy. That is probably as deep as I can go in this book for now. I hope it's been enlightening. I hope it's been interesting. If you are experiencing anxiety and want to know how to manage that better in your own life without necessarily needing professional help, then I do suggest you get this book and read it. I think it could be a very useful resource for people. And yeah, so we can now resurface from the depths. We can get some breath, get some air, and process the treasures that we have found. And now a quote from John Milton. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Thank you.